I played the recording back at 6 in the morning with the coffee running. I'd set the phone up the night before, left it in the hallway outside her door on airplane mode, on top of the bookshelf where it would pick up sound through her partially open door. Simple arrangement. She'd asked me to do it. She wanted to know what she said in her sleep. And I had a phone, and this was a favor between two people who had been sharing a kitchen for 14 months. I pressed play, expecting to hear some ambient murmur, half words, fragments. The blank interior of someone else's dreaming. Her voice said my name. I stopped moving. I stood at the counter and listened to the next 43 minutes, with the mug cooling in my hand, and she said my name 11 times. Not always just the name, sometimes a phrase around it, sometimes just the two syllables surfacing in the middle of something she was working through, like a word her sleeping mind kept returning to because it lived somewhere close to whatever she was processing. By the time the recording ended, I was not in the same position I'd been in when I pressed play, either physically or in any other sense. There is a specific kind of silence that follows finding something out when you weren't looking for it. Not the silence of surprise exactly, more the silence of something becoming true that you hadn't put language to yet. I sat in it for a while, then I refilled the coffee, got dressed, and went to work. Because what do you do at 6:45 on a Tuesday morning when your roommate has just told you something in her sleep that she hasn't said while she's awake? Her name was Nora Pemberton. She'd answered my ad 14 months ago. A 2-bedroom in a building I'd been in for 3 years. Previous roommate relocated. Room available, reasonable. She'd come on a Saturday morning with a plant tucked under one arm and a list of questions about natural light and water pressure and which set of neighbors were the loud ones. I said the right side. She asked how I knew. I said I kept a mental map of complaints. She laughed and said she'd take it. That was the entirety of our formal getting to know you. The rest happened the way it happens when you live in adjacent spaces with someone. Slowly, through proximity, through the accumulation of small daily interactions that mean nothing individually and a great deal collectively. Whose turn it was for dish soap. The month she was working toward a difficult deadline and existed entirely on cereal and instant coffee, and I started leaving extra food in the kitchen without mentioning it, extra pasta, an extra portion of whatever I'd made, and she didn't mention it either, just ate it, and one morning said thank you in a way that sounded like it was about more than the pasta. The morning I came home from something I was not going to explain to a relative stranger, and she took one look at me from across the kitchen and said, "I'm making eggs, sit down," and did not ask a single question for the rest of the evening, which is how I understood I was not living with a relative stranger anymore. The conversations that develop across enough shared mornings have a different quality than conversations you have in situations where you're presenting a version of yourself. Kitchen conversations happen before the considered version is assembled. You're standing at the counter in last night's t-shirt waiting for the coffee to finish, and someone walks in and says something true, and you say something true back, and the truth of it doesn't cost either of you anything because it's 6:50 in the morning and no one has started performing yet. She was honest in that kitchen way. She'd tell me something real about her day in the same breath as asking if there was enough milk, not because she'd decided to confide, but because it was morning, and the thought was there, and it came out. I learned more about how her mind worked from those unguarded mornings than from any of our longer, deliberate conversations. She trusted her instincts and then spent considerable energy arguing herself out of them. She was kinder to other people's failures than to her own, and considerably funnier when she wasn't trying to be. She'd wanted to study something different than what she'd ended up studying, had made peace with the decision, and also hadn't, and held this quietly without putting it anywhere. I told her things too, not the things I'd have said in a deliberate conversation, the other things, the unguarded ones. That I had a whole category of music I only listened to when I was alone because it made me embarrassingly emotional. That there was something I'd said to someone I cared about, years ago, that I'd never found the right way to undo, and that the not undoing of it was something I'd been carrying for so long I'd almost stopped noticing the weight. I told her this one morning over coffee, not meaning to, and she said, "Some things don't get undone, they just change weight." I thought about that sentence for days afterward. 14 months of this. She'd repotted the plant from the apartment viewing twice. I knew her work hours and her coffee order and the specific cadence of the music she played when she was in a good mood versus the music she played when she was in the particular mood I'd learned to navigate around carefully. I knew which of her silences were fine and which ones weren't. She knew which of mine needed space and which ones needed interruption, and she was reliably right about which was which, better than most people who had known me considerably longer. We had, without designing it, built something that had the texture and trust of a long friendship, the ease, the private language, the specific shorthand of two people who have been honest with each other across enough shared mornings that the honesty has become a habit rather than a choice. I wasn't neutral about her. I'd known this for a while in the way you know things you've decided not to examine, filed in the category of true things that I wasn't going to act on, because acting on them would put something at risk that I didn't want to risk. She was also seeing Derek. Had been for 7 months. He came to the apartment on Wednesdays and Saturdays, occasionally on Sundays that felt planned despite being framed as spontaneous, and he was personable. That is the most accurate word I have for him. He was good in rooms, attentive to Nora in the visible ways, the kind of person it's difficult to have a specific objection to on a first or second or fifth encounter. I didn't have a clear feeling about him either way, which I've since understood is itself a feeling, and not a neutral one. The sleep talking had come up as a topic about 3 weeks before the recording. She'd mentioned it before. It had been a thing she knew about herself from childhood, something her family had noted. But recently, it had come up with more specific curiosity, because her sister had mentioned on a call that she'd heard it through the wall during a visit years ago. That had stayed with Nora, the idea that she had a whole verbal interior she had no access to. "Do you ever hear anything?" she asked me. "Occasionally," I said. "Nothing specific, more like sounds that could be words." Which was true. I'd registered the murmur of it through the wall a few times late at night, enough to know it was there, never enough to make out anything particular. "I want to know what I say," she said. "It's strange to not know." She poured more coffee. "People think they have privacy in their own heads. I don't even have privacy in my own sleep. You could set a recording app. My phone dies overnight. Use mine," I said. "I'll set it on airplane mode and leave it in the hallway. It's sensitive enough." She considered this. "That's slightly strange. You asked." "I did ask," she agreed. And then, after a moment, "Yeah, okay." So that night I set the phone recording on airplane mode on top of the hallway bookshelf outside her door, where it would catch sound through the 2 inches she left the door open for airflow, and in the morning I retrieved it before she was up and took it to the kitchen. I want to be clear about the intention, because the rest of what happened requires it to be clear. I was helping her answer a question she'd asked me to help answer. I was not looking for anything. The recording was an act of domestic helpfulness between two people who had been sharing a kitchen for 14 months. And when I pressed play, I genuinely believed I was going to hear something ambient and unspecific. The word elevator, the word Tuesday, some fragment of a dream about her job or her family, or whatever the sleeping mind was sorting through. Then she said my name. She said it at the 4-minute mark, in the middle of a sentence that had started with something I couldn't fully make out. Just the 2 syllables, clearly, with a tone that was not distressed or confused but something else. The tone of someone saying a name that is a fixed point. The way you say a name you say regularly, the way you say it when it's not chosen, when it just arrives because it's what's there. I set down the coffee mug. I stood at the counter and listened to the rest. At 9 minutes she said something I couldn't make out and then laughed, which is a specific and disorienting thing to hear in a recording of someone sleeping. The laugh she makes when something catches her genuinely off guard, the one that goes brief and bright. I replayed that segment 3 times. At 13 minutes she said my name again, this time with what sounded like a question on the end. The inflection rose, but whatever she was asking was lost before it arrived. I replayed it twice. I still couldn't make out the question, only the name and the rising inflection that meant something was being asked of someone she expected to be there. At 22 minutes she said my name and then said, "I know," plainly, like an answer, like something had been put to her and she was providing the response. The tone of someone who has been asked something they've already thought about, and whose answer is settled, "I know." I did not replay the 22-minute mark. I stood at the counter and let it go forward. At 35 minutes, In a voice that was quieter than the others, closer to the phone or maybe just more careful, she said, "I'm not asleep." She was, of course, asleep. She was definitionally asleep. I'd checked. The light under her door was off. She wouldn't be up for another hour and a half. But she said it with the specificity of someone addressing a particular person, in the tone you use when you want a specific someone to know something. And the something was, "I'm not asleep. I'm here. I know you're there." I stopped the recording. The kitchen was quiet. The coffee was cold. The light through the window had the specific quality of early morning in a city, the gray that belongs to the hour before it belongs to anyone. 11 times in 43 minutes. 11 uses of a name that is, in any waking context, just the name of the person she lives with, the person who keeps the good coffee in the third cabinet and leaves extra pasta on the stove without discussing it. In her sleep, apparently that name was something her interior returned to, something that lived in her at a level below the place where you decide what to say. I got dressed and went to work. I did not delete the recording. I also did not, in the course of that Tuesday, do anything resembling focused professional work. I had 4 meetings and was present for portions of each of them. I had lunch at my desk and cannot tell you what I ate. I answered emails and then found I'd answered several of them inadequately and had to follow up. What I was doing for most of the day was thinking about what I was holding and what, if anything, it was mine to do with. On the walk home, I tried to construct a clear account of the situation. I had made a recording at someone's request. The recording contained information she had asked me to find. The information was hers and I should give it to her. This was a simple structure and it held for about 3 blocks, and then it ran into the problem of "I'm not asleep," which was not a simple thing, and which made the simple structure feel like it was missing several rooms. That evening she cooked dinner. Nothing planned, just rice and vegetables, the kind of meal you make when you're tired and hungry and not thinking about what you're making. And we ate at the kitchen table and talked, and she asked me about my day, and I said it was fine, and she told me about something that had happened at her office that was mildly absurd, and we both laughed about it. And I sat across the table from her and thought about 43 minutes of her sleeping voice, and said nothing. She had no way to know what I was sitting with. She was just having dinner with her roommate on a Tuesday evening. I was doing a more complicated version of the same thing. I kept the recording for 3 days before she asked. The Wednesday morning in between was the specific kind of difficult that doesn't look like anything from the outside. She came into the kitchen at her usual time, in her usual state of being assembled but not yet fully assembled, and made her coffee the way she made it every morning, and asked if I'd used the last of the good bread, and I said no. It was behind the cereal, and she found it and made toast, and we talked about something entirely ordinary, something about a project she was working on, something about the building's elevator being slow again, and none of it was different from 500 other mornings, except that I was sitting at the kitchen table with 43 minutes of her sleeping voice in my phone, and she was standing at the toaster entirely unaware of it. I kept thinking about the 22-minute mark. About the specific tone of the word no, not uncertain, not surprised, not the tone of someone discovering something, the tone of someone confirming something they already knew. I looked at her standing at the toaster and thought, she knows something. She has known it in her sleep for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer. And she is standing here making toast without knowing that she knows it. And I thought, so do I, so have I, and I am also sitting here making no mention of it. We were doing the same thing from opposite sides of a kitchen table. "Did you get anything from the phone?" she said, over dinner on Thursday. She was making pasta, which was its own small irony, and she asked it the way she asked most things, directly, without the careful approach that most people use when they want to know something that might be awkward. "Some," I said. "What kind of some?" "Sentences that don't quite finish. Some names." She looked up from the pasta. "Whose names?" I looked at her. The recording was on my phone, in my pocket, 8 feet away. "Yours a few times." Which was technically true. She had said her own name once, at the 8-minute mark, in what might have been a mid-dream correction of something. A few other things I couldn't make out. "That's weird," she said. "Sleep talking is weird," I said. She looked at me for a moment, in the specific way she sometimes looked at me when she was deciding whether to push on something, and then she nodded and went back to the pasta. We ate. We talked about something else. I did not tell her about the 11 times she'd said mine, and I spent the dinner being very present in the conversation we were having, while also occupying a separate part of my attention with the conversation I wasn't having. I've thought about why, since then, and the honest answer has a few layers. The first layer is that I didn't know what telling her would mean. The recording existed in a different register than a normal conversation. It was evidence of something she hadn't chosen to share, and using it felt like entering a room I hadn't been invited into. I needed to understand what I was holding before I decided anything about it. The second layer, which I only got to over the following days, is that I was afraid. Not of the information itself, but of what the information said about me. That I had listened to the recording carefully enough to count the instances. That I had replayed the 22-minute mark 4 times. That "I'm not asleep" had been living in me since 6:15 Tuesday morning and had not gotten any lighter in 3 days of carrying it. The third layer is the one that required the most honesty. I was afraid of what giving her the recording would mean for the thing between us, which I had been declining to name. Giving her the recording would make something visible that I had been keeping in the peripheral vision of my own attention, something I could see if I looked at it directly and had been choosing not to, because looking at it directly would make it into a thing that had to be addressed. By the weekend, I understood what I was actually holding. 14 months of paying a quality of attention to someone that I paid to very little else in my life, and evidence that this attention had a counterpart, that somewhere in her interior, in the part that operated without her making decisions about it, something was returning to my name with the consistency of something that had become a fixed point. Then Derek gave her an ultimatum. I found out on Saturday. He came to dinner, they went out after, and she came back alone around 11. I was in the living room and heard the door, and she came through the hallway in the specific stillness she wore when she was maintaining composure by effort rather than ease. She didn't comment on the fact that I was still up. She came and sat in the corner of the couch, her corner, the one with the lamp behind it that she'd claimed early in the first month and that I'd stopped thinking of as shared space, and she looked at the middle distance and I waited. "He wants me to move in with him," she said. "How do you feel about that?" He framed it as a question and then clarified it wasn't. She still had her coat on, which told me she hadn't fully arrived yet. He said if I'm not ready to commit after 7 months, he doesn't think I'm going to be, and he'd rather know now than later. "Did he give you a timeline?" "Sunday." She looked at me. "He wants an answer by Sunday." Sunday was 4 days away. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I'm thinking 4 days is a very specific number of days," she said. "I'm thinking someone who gives you 4 days to decide whether to reorganize your life doesn't have a lot of confidence in what your answer would be with more time than that." She paused. "And I'm thinking I don't know what I'd have said if he'd asked instead of required." The living room was quiet. The lamp put its small circle of light around her corner of the couch. I was aware, in the specific way I'd been aware of things about her for a while without looking at the awareness directly, of how clearly I could read her, the coat still on, the particular set of her hands, the quality of the silence she was sitting in. I looked at her. The recording was in my phone in the other room, the coffee in the third cabinet, the pasta without discussing it, 11 times. "I'm not asleep. Do you want to move in with him?" I asked. She held her coat and looked at the wall and was quiet in the way that is its own answer, if you know how to read it. I had been learning how to read it for 14 months. I read it. After a while she got up, said goodnight with the kind of brevity that means a person is holding something they don't want to spill, and went to her room. I sat in the living room with the lamp on and thought about what I was holding and what it was for, and whether the two were the same question. I thought about it for 2 days, not about what the recording meant for me or what I wanted from it. I held that separately and tried to stay with the actual question, which was, what did she need to know before Sunday, and was that my decision to make? There's a version of the ethics of it that is simple. She asked me to record her. She asked me to find out what she said in her sleep. The recording existed because she'd wanted the information. The fact that the information turned out to be something neither of us anticipated when she asked doesn't change the underlying structure. She'd asked a question, and I had the answer, and I'd been sitting on the answer for 12 days. There's a more complicated version, which is that the recording gave me access to something she hadn't consciously chosen to share, and using it without her knowledge was its own kind of intrusion regardless of how I'd come to have it. I had been standing in a hallway of her interior that she hadn't known she'd left open. The information was hers, but having it without her knowing I had it was a kind of asymmetry that felt wrong to maintain. I went back and forth between these for 2 days. I thought about what it would mean to tell her and have her make a decision based on something she'd said in her sleep without choosing to. I thought about what it would mean not to tell her and watch her make a decision without that information. I also thought, with the honesty I was trying to practice, about what the recording had told me about myself. Not about what to do with it, about me. I had replayed the 22-minute mark 4 times. I had carried the sentence, "I'm not asleep" in me since Tuesday, and it had not gotten lighter. I had known for a long time that I wasn't neutral about her, and the recording didn't tell me something new about that. It told me something I already knew in a different and more audible way. The reason I'd been reluctant to show her the recording was not entirely ethical complexity. Some of it was fear of what showing her would make undeniable for both of us. What resolved it, finally, was the simplest version. She was being asked to make a significant decision quickly, and one piece of information relevant to that decision was in a recording she had specifically asked me to make. Whatever the ethical complexity of how I'd come to hold it, she had asked for it. Holding it past Sunday because I was afraid of what giving it to her would mean for me was not a defensible position. On Sunday evening, she texted him. She didn't tell me until the next morning. On Monday morning, she knocked on my door. I told him I needed more time, she said. She was in the doorway in her work clothes, coat on. The same stillness from Saturday, but a slightly different quality of it. Less maintained, more decided. He said that was his answer. She sat down on the edge of my bed. She had the look of someone who'd made a choice that cost something and was still working out what the cost was worth. "I have something to tell you," I said. I got the phone. I sat on the other end of the bed, far enough away that we had the distance the moment required, close enough that I could see her hands, and I played her the recording. All 43 minutes of it. I did not look at her while it played. I looked at the window and listened to the building's ordinary morning sounds and let the 43 minutes run out. I had thought about stopping it at certain points and letting her react, or skipping to the specific moments. I decided against both. She deserved the whole thing, in order, the way it had happened. The room was very quiet when it finished. She was still looking at the phone. 11 times, she said. Yes. She picked the phone up and set it down again, carefully, like something that might need to be handled. "I'm not asleep," she said. 35 minutes in. She was quiet for a while after that, long enough that the heating system clicked on and ran and clicked off, long enough that the quality of light through the window shifted slightly, the way it shifts when morning commits to being morning. "How long have you had this?" she said. 12 days. She looked at me. "You didn't tell me." "No." I looked at the floor. "I didn't know what telling you was going to mean. I needed to understand what I was holding before I decided whether it was mine to use." I looked back up at her. "I should have told you sooner, a lot sooner." "Yes," she said. "Not accusation, the honest kind of agreement, accounting for both sides of it. I asked you to find out what I said, and then I asked you on Thursday what you found." She looked at the phone between us. "And you said my own name once. I wasn't ready to give you the rest of it." "Why?" I looked at her. "Because giving you what the rest of it contained was going to be a different kind of conversation than a thing I did with a phone in a hallway as a favor." She held that for a moment. "Then and now. And now you were being asked to make a decision by Sunday, and the recording had information that was relevant to that decision, and I'd had it for 12 days and hadn't given it to you. It wasn't a position I could defend anymore. Not to you and not to myself." She looked at the phone for a long time. At the recording, which was still open on the screen, still sitting at the 43-minute mark. 11 times, she said again, quieter. "Yes. In my sleep. Which means I wasn't choosing it." She paused. "You can't say someone's name 11 times in your sleep without knowing something." She said it carefully. "The way you say something you've just understood for the first time, even though some part of you understood it before. I've been knowing something," she said, mostly to herself, "and sleeping through it." I looked at her. I said, "I'm not asleep," she said. "In my sleep. Yes. Which means I knew I was. And I said it anyway." She looked up from the phone and at me. "I've been having a different version of this conversation in my sleep for 2 weeks. And you've had the recording of it for 12 days. She paused. We've both been holding things. Yes, I said. We have. She was quiet for another moment, and then she did something I had only seen her do twice in 14 months. She let the precise stillness drop, just briefly, just enough that what was behind it was visible. It was not nothing. It was in fact considerably more than nothing. I'm not going to move in with Derek, she said. I know. Not because of this. She gestured at the phone. Because of what happened when he asked. Which was nothing. For too long. That was already its own answer. She looked at the phone one more time. But this is a different answer. To a different question. Yes, I said. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has found a piece of furniture they didn't know was in the room and is deciding where it should go. Ask it, she said. I asked it. I'm not going to tell you exactly what I said, because some conversations belong to the people who have them and not to the telling of them afterward. What I'll tell you is that it was short. Shorter than 12 days of carrying it would have suggested, and it was the honest version. Not the careful version, not the managed version that would have protected me if it didn't land right. The one I'd been declining to say for a reason I'd spent 12 days understanding was fear, and that I now understood was not the right reason to keep declining it. It landed the way the right sentence lands when it's finally said, like something that was already in the room, already true, just waiting to be named. She said something back, also short, also the honest version, the one she'd been sleeping through for 2 weeks, now awake in the room between us. We sat on the edge of the bed with the recording between us on the phone, and the morning continued outside the window in its ordinary way, and neither of us moved for a while. There are moments that don't need anything added to them. They're already complete, already enough, and the only right response is to let them be what they are. This was one of those. We let it. She's still in the apartment. The plant from the viewing has been repotted 3 times now. She bought a second one about 2 weeks after the Monday morning, a small trailing thing she put on my side of the kitchen windowsill and said was mine to keep alive. I have been keeping it alive. We haven't changed the lease or discussed changing it. There hasn't been a reason to, and there is, we've found, something worth keeping about the particular life that develops between 2 people across enough shared kitchen mornings. Worth keeping intact, not disrupted, even when the thing between them becomes something that requires a different name than roommates and hasn't yet acquired its permanent one. Derek texted her 3 days later. She responded, and she told me about it because she volunteers information to me now the way she always did, just with fewer things withheld underneath. He was gracious about it, she said, genuinely, not performatively. It was a kind conversation, the kind that happens when 2 people are both being honest about something that didn't work, and both know it. She was glad she'd waited for more time rather than giving him the answer he'd been trying to close before she had it. Some people give you a deadline, she said, because they're afraid of what your real answer would be if you had enough time to hear it yourself. I've thought since then about what a recording actually captures, about the ethics of it, which are real and which I won't pretend resolve simply. There's a version of this story where holding the recording for 12 days without telling her was wrong. Maybe it was wrong for 12 days and then became right, or maybe it was wrong throughout and the outcome was good despite the wrong. I don't have a clean answer for this, and I'm not going to pretend to. The honest account is, I was afraid, and my fear kept the information from her longer than was right, and the fear was about me and what the information meant for me, and that is not a flattering accounting, but it's the accurate one. What I keep arriving at, underneath the accounting, is this, she had asked. She had asked me specifically to find out what she said in her sleep, because she wanted access to the things her sleeping self said that her waking self didn't know. The sleeping self turned out to have more information than the waking one. That's not unusual. We know more than we say, more than we let into the language we control. Sleep is where the extra knowing lives, unguarded, because nothing is deciding what to say in sleep. The guard is down. The interior is audible. Her sleeping voice said my name 11 times and then said, "I'm not asleep." Which is the specific and poetic thing about it. She said, in her sleep, that she was not asleep. She said it in the tone of someone who wants to be known to be present, and the waking version of her was about to make a decision about where she lived and who she was living toward without that information, without knowing what her unguarded self had been saying every night in the room next to mine. I had the information. She had asked for it. The question I finally had to answer was not, should I give it to her? It was, what is my reason for not giving it to her? And when I found the honest answer to that, I understood what I also had to do. We both knew something before the recording. The recording made the knowing audible, for both of us, eventually. I think that's what it was for. And I think that's what most honesty is for in the end. Not to be impressive, not to be brave, but because the alternative is carrying something that belongs to another person and never giving it back to them. She had asked what she said in her sleep. She deserved to know. Here's what I've been thinking about. Have you ever known something about yourself that you couldn't put into language while you were awake? Something your habits knew, or your body knew, or your sleeping voice knew long before your waking mind would admit it? And underneath that, is there someone whose name you'd say, if no one was choosing, whose name you've already been saying in the quiet, without deciding to, in the space where you're most honest with yourself? Write it in the comments. I'll be reading every one. If stories like this find you when you need them, subscribe. There's more where this came from. And if you've ever been the person with the recording, the one who knew something they weren't sure was theirs to use, I want to hear about that too.